The Tocqueville program exists to encourage serious and open engagement with the moral and philosophic questions at the heart of political life. The Tocqueville program includes a whole range of courses and extracurricular activities you can find out about from the materials beautifully arrayed on the table just outside this door. The students, check us out. If you want a genuine liberal education while you're here at Furman, we want you involved in our courses and activities. The Tocqueville program is sponsored by a broad coalition of philanthropic organizations and generous individual donors, including our founding donors, Ginny and Sandy McNeil, the Andrew Waite Carlton Family Foundation, Beth and Ravenel Curry, the Bradley Foundation, and many others. Our sponsors support the Tocqueville program in the belief that genuine liberal education encourages students to become more thoughtful citizens and more dignified human beings. And we are immensely grateful for their support. I'd also like to say another quick word of thanks to Jenna Story, the managing director of the Tocqueville program, and to Paige Blankenship, our assistant. Coordinating an event like this means a lot of moving parts to go together, and they do the lion's share of that work, so thanks to them. And one final thanks again to the College Democrats, the College Republicans, and the Endowed Lecture Fund, who are sponsoring us. Now, to introduce today's speakers. 5 years ago, the Tocqueville program hosted a lecture series on biotechnology and politics, and our events included a visit from Robbie George, who is one of the foremost living thinkers on questions such as embryonic stem cell research. While he was here, he told us that, somewhat to his own surprise, he'd begun teaching courses with Cornel West. The rest of us were somewhat surprised too. After all, these two men have well-earned reputations as lions of the left and the right, respectively. For example, Cornel West is an honorary chairman of the Democratic Socialists of America, and he has recently been a vocal and visible participant in the Black Lives Matter movement, traveling to Ferguson, Missouri, for the express purpose of getting arrested in protest of the police shooting death of Michael Brown. Robbie George, for his part, has been called by the New York Times America's most influential conservative Christian thinker, and has taken firm public stands against abortion, embryonic stem cell research, and the redefinition of marriage. Both are famous for the uncompromising frankness with which they make the arguments that have brought them to public attention. Left and right, forceful and uncompromising, yet friends. They are indeed something of an odd couple. Odd, perhaps, but exemplary. Individually, their credentials are not just impeccable, but unbelievable. I count some 49 books the two of them have either authored or edited, not to mention hip-hop albums and appearances in the Matrix movies, Professor West, the Presidential Citizens Medal, and the chairmanship of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, Professor George. But more than their individual accomplishments, it is their intellectual friendship that made Dr. Testor, my wife, Dr. Story, and I particularly eager to bring them to campus. We thought it would be useful to give Furman an example of the free and friendly exchange of ideas by two outstanding minds who know how to love one's brother without mincing words. In a moment when students and faculty often protest the very presence of controversial speakers on college campuses. In a time when we hear that unintentional microaggressions should be banished from academic life so that no one ever has to endure feeling offended, even in small ways. In a time when famous comedians, from Chris Rock to Jerry Seinfeld, have begun avoiding college campuses because students often can't take a joke, we thought there could be no better way to demonstrate the genuine meaning of academic freedom than to have these two men with us to talk about a subject as controversial as they are, Christianity and politics. Ladies and gentlemen, Professors Cornel West and Robert P. George.
Thank you so much, Professor Story. Let me begin on behalf of Cornel and myself saying just how honored and delighted we are to be here and to be participating in the life of this distinguished university and of the Tocqueville program. We have enormous admiration for what you're doing. It's what we try to do in our courses together and separately at Princeton and at Union. So we feel like we're part of your family and you're part of our family. So we're here for a family visit as far as we're concerned. We join you in praying for Professor Tessitore. We have enormous gratitude for what he has done in the Tocqueville program, and we wish him the very best and a speedy recovery and right back to where he needs to be, which is teaching students and being part of the intellectual life, full part of the intellectual life of this community. And Ben and Jenna, congratulations. You and your team have put together really something magnificent here. We had the experience just a few minutes ago of meeting with a group of your wonderful students and discussing deep and great ideas for an hour and a half. And gosh, so impressive, so wonderful, wonderful questions, wonderful insights. The evidence that what you're doing is worthwhile was right there in the room in the thoughts and questions that were raised by those students. And I want to say how delighted I am that you've chosen the topic of Christianity and politics. One of the things that Professor West and I have in common, of course, is a shared Christian faith and a certain involvement in politics. It's brought both of us no end of trouble and headaches. Maybe we've caused a bit of trouble and a few headaches along the way, but it's part of our vocation. So we're Christians in politics. How's that work? Aren't religion and politics not supposed to mix? What's the deal here? All right, sometimes it pays to go back to fundamentals. So let me begin our deliberation and conversation together by going back to some basics. What is politics? Well, the great teacher of us all had a very simple, basic definition of politics. Aristotle said politics is about how we order our lives together as communities. How do we order our lives? On what principles do we form our social relationships, order our common lives as citizens? And what institutions shall we create and maintain or reform with a view to ordering our lives together well? Okay, then what is religion? Well, Aristotle didn't favor us with a definition of religion. Nor has the Supreme Court so far. They resolve cases about religion all the time, but they haven't told us what it is. But let me offer some thoughts about what it is, provisionally, thoughts about what it is, and we can refine them as we go along, or you can correct me, or Professor West can correct me. I think religion is about the great existential questions of meaning and purpose in life. What are we doing here? Where did we come from? Where are we ultimately going? Is this world of efficient and material causality all there is? Or are there spiritual realities that are not accessible immediately by sense, by our sight or vision or smell, our sight or hearing or smell? In other words, religion is about questions of human nature, dignity, and destiny. Is there a God? An ultimate source of the intelligibilities that we grasp in our intellectual inquiries. An ultimate source of what is, or at least what is good in the world. Or are there multiple gods? Or are there spiritual realities that wouldn't be captured by the concept of deity? There are, after all, religions that are literally atheistic, that is, that do not involve a god, some forms of Buddhism, for example, Theravada Buddhism, but still believe that there are spiritual realities. Or is this all there is? Are we material creatures in a world of material and efficient causality, and that's just it? However one answers that question, religion and religions propose additional questions and additional answers. And the most important of those has to do with how do we live with authenticity and integrity in line with our best judgments of human nature, dignity, and destiny, whether there's a God, whether there's a source of what Martin Luther King calls a higher law above the law of the state that might enjoin us to do things that are very difficult for us frail, fallen human beings to do, like love one another, even love our enemies, do unto others as we would be done by them. How do we live with authenticity and integrity in view of our best answers? And that's a set of questions that everyone has to answer, even if you are an atheist, not simply in the sense of you belong to a religion that doesn't posit a deity, but if you're an atheist in Richard Dawkins' sense or Bill Maher's sense. Professor West engages with Bill Maher very, very frequently. Hasn't managed to teach him anything yet, but he engages with him very frequently.
Still working on it.
Even an atheist like Dawkins or an atheist like Maher has to ask the question, okay, if all there is this world of material and efficient causality, how can I nevertheless live with authenticity and integrity in view of that reality? Much more serious atheistic or non-theistic thinkers like Camus have wrestled with those questions in very illuminating ways. All right, so politics, how we order our lives together. Religion, is there a God? Are there spiritual realities? How do we relate to them? What is the nature of human beings, perhaps as children made in the image and likeness of God? What is our dignity, our specific dignity of human beings? Are we actually made in the image and likeness of God as Judeo-Christian scripture tells us? What is our destiny? Will we someday be in another place, in another reality with God, or perhaps condemned to a hell? Politics and religion. Now, much of the modern liberal political theory project is dedicated to separating those sets of questions. Separating the question, how shall we order our lives together, from the question, what does it all mean? What does it mean to lead a truly human life? Is there a fundamental dignity to human beings? How do we respect the fundamental dignity of human beings? And liberal political theory has aimed at that objective, at that separation, not out of animus toward religion, not out of any kind of anti-religious hatred, not even out of the idea that there are no answers to religious questions. They're all just speculative. Liberal political theory, modern liberal political theory, has aimed to separate the question, how do we live together, from the great existential questions in order to lower the stakes of politics. To give us less or less important things to fight about in the political sphere. And again, though I and Professor West have both been critics of that tradition of political theory, you have to respect it, because we do know that very bad things can happen when the stakes of politics are very high. Wars of religion, crusades, jihads, holy wars, where the enemy to be defeated is to be defeated not simply because he's got the wrong idea of democracy or aristocracy or monarchy, but because he's the enemy of God. Modern liberal political theory is a reaction, an understandable and not unreasonable reaction to some horrible things that have been done by religious people in the name of religion. And we have to take that, even those of us who are critics, have to take that on board. That's for real. Only problem is it doesn't work. And here's where the criticism comes in. The greatest of the liberal political philosophers of the late 20th, second half of the 20th century, John Rawls, devoted his life to a heroic effort to crack the nut, to solve the problem that his great predecessors in the tradition that begins with Hobbes and Locke, that solved the question that they, in the end, could not solve. How do we separate properly political questions from religious questions? And Rawls, because he was a man of integrity and a highly intelligent man, when he talked about the religious side of the equation, didn't simply mean specific traditional religions like Judaism or Islam or Catholicism. He meant any comprehensive view, I'm using his language, any comprehensive view, be it religious in the traditional sense or secular. So even liberalism itself, as Rawls so astutely noticed, could be a religion and did in fact function as a religion that competed with the traditional faiths. A secular religion, the religion of Kant and Mill, that competes with Judaism, Islam, Christianity. And of course, by the same token, non-liberal political worldviews such as Marxism or fascism function as religions. They are comprehensive views. They represent a particular take on human nature, dignity, and destiny that competes with the others. So Rawls tried to devise a purely political liberalism that people of all faiths, secular and religious, liberals, Catholics, Orthodox Jews, Muslims, could affirm because it prescinded from the great existential questions, the questions of meaning. But again, it failed, and at this point, I draw the conclusion that it failed because it must fail. There is no way to separate the question, how should we order our lives together, from the great questions of meaning and existence, of human nature, dignity, and destiny. We should order our lives together one way rather than another, depending on, among other things, what the truth is about human nature, human dignity or sanctity, human destiny. We can't prescind from the question, what is the human being? Is the human being merely molecules in motion? Just one more creature in that world of efficient and material causality, with no real freedom or no real rationality. Very devout and consistent atheists will even explain away consciousness itself as an illusion. That matters to the question, how shall we order our lives together? There ultimately is no separation. So for me, the question then becomes, all right, since we can't prescind from those questions, since the great religious questions will affect our judgments as to how to order our lives together, and we'll enter into those judgments even if we try to keep them out. I mean, one of the problems with Rawls's view, as I myself have argued, rightly or wrongly, but my view is that he has to necessarily, unavoidably smuggle some ideas about human nature, dignity, and destiny into his allegedly purely political liberalism. But if that's true, and if we're going to do it in the light of day, and if we're going to be clear and upfront about how our views on the great existential question should inform our answers to the question, how do we lead our lives together, then we have to face up to how do we do this without raising the stakes of politics so high that politics can become a deadly business, where fellow citizens who disagree don't become enemies because they disagree. That they still have a common good around which they integrate their relationships, order their lives together, despite their differences, not just on, shall we put the stop signs on the east-west direction of the intersection or the north-south direction, but even on questions, is there a God? Are human beings made in his image and likeness? And then many of the deep moral questions that we debate today, abortion, marriage, death penalty, immigration, all the issues that are so divisive in our own politics. And of course, I come at it, as I said, from the perspective of a Christian, not from just any religious faith, but from the perspective of the Christian faith. I think as a Christian, I have a lot to learn from people of other traditions. If you know anything about me, you know that much of my vocation involves working in cooperation with people from the Jewish and Muslim and Mormon and Baha'i and Buddhist and Hindu traditions, and I think that's very, very important. But I'll look at it from the point of view of Christianity. And when I do that, I go right back to Genesis 1, as any Jew or Christian who's serious about his faith must. So that the fundamental starting point of all political deliberation is human beings have a unique sanctity because they are made in the image and likeness of God. They are free and rational. And that freedom and rationality, that power of creativity, needs to be respected and honored in how he's treated, how we treat each other as individuals and through the institutions of a political community. From that, I think very strong cases can be made for various sorts of positions, whether it's on the life issues, for example, or on the questions of political systems. I think the strongest case for democracy, and remember, democracy is a minority position in the history of political thought, but I think the case for democracy is a case that's rooted in the equality of human beings, which is a principle which is in turn rooted in the dignity of human beings as creatures made in the image and likeness of God. Now, my particular brand of Christianity is one that affirms the idea of a natural law. So I don't think that we must rely exclusively on the data of revelation, even for the articulation of the principle of the dignity of the human person. I think that a so-called secular argument can be made, which reflects a Judeo-Christian understanding that God does things not arbitrarily, but for reasons, and that we, as people who have been gifted, creatures who have been gifted with powers of intellect, can, at least to some extent, through a glass darkly. There's a good Kierkegaardian critique that Professor West is formulating even as we speak here. Imperfectly and with errors, understand God's reasons. Understand each other as made in the image and likeness of God, which accounts in Christian tradition for why St. Paul can say that even the Gentiles who don't have the law of Moses nevertheless can tell right from wrong because there's a law written on their hearts. Christian thinkers have called that the natural law, which is sufficient for moral accountability and in St. Paul's terms even for judgment. But again, this is a particular Christian, and even within Christianity, a particular Christian Catholic view of the basis of something like democracy as rooted in equality. I mean, the fundamental problem with aristocracy for me, which may have many advantages, the fundamental problem for me is that it disrespects the equal dignity of the human being. Democracy favors it. And yet we have to, even there, be very cautious because Hitler is voted in by democratic means. As Pope John Paul II reminded us, democracy gets 2 cheers, not 3. And it can't get the 3 because it's not an end, it's a means. It doesn't guarantee a just result anymore, as I argue to my fellow conservatives, sometimes unsuccessfully, any more than we can conclude that because an outcome is the product of a free market, that it's a just outcome. I'm all for the market. I think it would be a catastrophe to move to a socialist economy away from a market economy. And yet the regulation of the market is justified by the fact that we can't equate a just outcome with a market outcome on the ground that the market can never produce an unjust outcome. The same for democracy. I don't want to get rid of democracy. I want to defend it to the death. And yet I want to recognize that democracy can produce very unjust results. It can produce even a Hitler. Tyrants can be voted into power. And that reflects another religious view, one that I think is highly relevant to politics, one which James Madison believed was highly relevant to politics. My evidence for that is Federalist Paper number 10, and that is human fallenness and fallibility. Madison said the fundamental problems for government are two. One, to control the people, given that people are fallen, frail creatures who are prone to selfishness, rapaciousness, envy, enmity. And then number two, the problem for government is to keep itself under control, because guess who government is? Human beings who are selfish, rapacious, given to envy, enmity, in love with power, influence, greed, and so forth. And democracy is not going to eliminate any of that, which is why even our choices within the democratic system have to be subject to moral principles, and why we have to care about the cultivation of virtue in our people, which is part of what your job is here, Jenna and Ben and the other professors, for education, to be an education not simply of mental techniques or intellectual techniques, but of the soul. Why do we want them? Why do we want our students wrestling with the great texts, with Plato, with Aristotle, with St. Augustine, with Luther, with Locke, with Dewey, with C.S. Lewis? We want them because we believe that in that engagement and wrestling with those ideas, they will be enriched as people. The education, in other words, will touch their souls and not only their minds. It's not a matter just of IQ. It's a matter of disposition and of the heart, because no system, no matter how good, wonderful democratic system, it can have a beautiful separation of powers. We can have federalism, all the institutional arrangements that have gone into our magnificent constitutional system can still produce and have produced grave injustice where there's a lack of virtue in the people. Famously, Madison, and I'll close with this point, famously Madison, who was educated in the Christian tradition, in the Presbyterian tradition, at Princeton, by his great teacher, John Witherspoon, the only minister to sign the Declaration of Independence, Scottish Presbyterian minister. Famously, Madison wanted to design a system of government that would, at least in part, supply the defect of better motives, where institutions and institutional structures and checks and balances and separations of power would help to make up for the fact that people are frail and fallen and given to selfishness and rapaciousness and envy and enmity and greed and so forth. But even Madison recognized that those constitutional structures could only partially supply that defect. That in the end, the justice or injustice of a society, whether it would be a well-ordered society, whether we will be ordering our lives together well or badly, will depend on choices reflecting our character, the virtues or vices of the people. Over to you, my brother.
Oh, that's good stuff. Good stuff. Now, I first want to say that I am blessed to be here. I've already had a magnificent time with the high-quality conversation with the wonderful students here. There's a Socratic energy that's at work at Furman University. That's a beautiful thing. It has something to do with intellectual courage. It has something to do with the willingness to raise some very unsettling questions. I want to salute the captain of the ship, my new friend and dear sister, President Elizabeth Davis. She was kind enough to meet us earlier, and her spirit is here. And what can I say about my new brothers and sisters, the doctors, the dynamic duo themselves, Ben and Jenna. I mean, the Tocqueville program is really a model when it comes to unleashing Socratic energy. And I must say with a heavy heart that I just learned just a few minutes ago that for me the greatest political theorist who was alive, his name is Sheldon Wolin, that he passed last night. That he was the author of magisterial volumes, Politics and Vision, published in 1960, volume 1. Volume 2 was written almost 40-some years later, Politics and Vision, volume 2. His greatest work, 2001, Tocqueville, Between Two Worlds, The Making of a Political and Theoretical Life. It's about a 700-page text. He poured his heart, mind, and soul in that text. He was a Jewish brother born in Buffalo. Went to Oberlin, trained at Harvard, taught at Oberlin and UC Berkeley. He also happened to be my thesis advisor. I love him. I love him to death. He was 93 years old, and I hope we'll always remember his name alongside the Leo Strausses and Eric Voegelins and John Rawls as towering figures in political theory, which is not to say that none of them got it right. That's not the point. Just like my brother, I love him deeply, but he's wrong on something. But it's not about that. It's about what the great W.B. Du Bois called integrity, honesty, decency, and a sense of virtue in the face of oppression, in the face of deception, in the face of insult, and in the face of brute force. And that's where I begin. I begin on a note of piety. And by piety, I don't mean blind obedience to doctrine. I don't mean uncritical deference to dogma. By piety, it goes back to Plato's Euthyphro. It goes back to John Dewey and George Santayana that said piety is the acknowledgement of the sources of good in our lives in our brief move from womb to tomb. And so we begin with the acknowledgement that we are who we are because somebody loved us, and somebody cared for us, and somebody attended to us. It begins with mom and dad. For me, it's Cliff and Irene. It begins with Shiloh Baptist Church on the chocolate side of Sacramento, California. Reverend Willie P. Cook and Deacon Hinton and Sarah Ray, Sunday school teachers. What do? They provide wind at one's back that gives one a sense of self-confidence and self-respect so that one engages these deep existential issues. See, when George Santayana, who was actually an atheist, but he was religiously musical, which is to say he was an atheist who could embrace the subject matter of religion without drawing religious conclusions. Chekhov was like that too. Anton Chekhov, atheist to the core, full of more love than many Christian churches, I know, but we won't go into that right now. But what I'm saying is that religion, Santayana says, is love of life and the consciousness of impotence. To look death, dread, despair, disappointment, and disease in the face and still have the courage to choose life. And at the political level, let's just be honest, human history is a dark affair. For the most part, it's a cycle of hatred and revenge, of domination and oppression, of exploitation and manipulation. And we have breaks when the love breaks the hatred, when the justice breaks the domination. And we get these few moments of fragile democratic experiments in which, lo and behold, justice begins to look briefly like love in public. And by love, I'm not talking about some mamby-pamby feeling. I'm talking about a steadfast commitment to the welfare of others. And those of us who have the audacity to call ourselves Christian, we build on the great moral revolution of Judaism, which of course echoed the best of what happened in Egypt, what happened in northern Africa. And what is that moral revolution of Judaism? The charge that we are to do justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with our God and embrace the orphan, the widow, the fatherless, the motherless, the weak, and the vulnerable, the poor, the hated, the demeaned, and the devalued. That's what it means to be human. That's not in Homer. It's not in Plato. It's not in Aristotle. It's not in Seneca. It was a different conception of being human in the world. I will make a covenant with you if you are willing to do justly, spread hesed, loving kindness, and be in solidarity with the weak and vulnerable. And those of us who have a profound love of a Palestinian Jew named Jesus, who comes out of that prophetic Judaism that says, what you do to the least of these, the prisoner, the poor, the marginal, you do unto me. That will be the measure of your life. It won't be how much money, it won't be how big your mansions are, it won't be your trophy spouse, even though it's nice to fall in love with somebody you like to look at. The quality of your life will be what kind of human being will you be? Kind of integrity and honesty and decency and virtue, what kind of enactments and embodiments of the holy and the good. Now, granted, I mean, it's good to be at an institution where I can talk about fellow Baptists, because it's not too many Baptists at Harvard or Yale or Princeton, you know what I mean? It's not that many Baptists at Union Theological Seminary. A lot of high church brothers and sisters, but not we everyday low church Baptists. But when I think of Furman, you know, the founder of this university was a revolutionary Christian. He was involved in an anti-imperialist war against a structure of domination called the British Empire. It's very important to keep in mind. I understand myself and the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. and Fannie Lou Hamer and Dorothy Day as revolutionary Christians, meaning what? Keeping track of whatever structures, institutions, or ideologies, or ways of life that lose sight of the sanctity and dignity of each individual, regardless of class, color, sexual orientation, civilization, those creatures who God has implanted God's image and likeness. And it warrants then a certain kind of treatment. Now, granted, of course, you know, Brother Furman, when it came to white supremacy and slavery, he opposed slavery early in his life, didn't he? He changed his mind later, which means even when you change your mind, you might necessarily be moving in the right direction. But we ought to be open to change our minds in that regard. But the very fact that we're still here in this space, owing to that ambiguous legacy of our dear brother Furman and the supporters and the sponsors of these kinds of dialogues to keep alive Socratic energy wedded to prophetic witness. For me, I begin with the existential issues, but my dear brother talked about Kierkegaard, and we've been at it now for 10 years, and it's always such a blessing to be in conversation with my dear brother, who I have deep love and respect for him in so many ways. That for me, it really is an existential issue. What does it really mean to be human? What kinds of persons are we going to choose in the short time that we're here? And when T.S. Eliot, probably the greatest of the Christian poets of the 20th century, alongside W.H. Auden, he said, for Christians, ours is in the trying, the rest is not our business. Yeah. We're not in control. The question is, what kind of witness are we going to bear? Will it be informed by a deep and profound love, a steadfast commitment to the welfare of others, so that as a Christian, when I look at politics, I just assume that politics, for the most part, is going to be characterized in many ways by legalized bribery and normalized corruption. It's just a question of how strong can the mechanisms of accountability be given the fallenness of we human beings dealing with the operations of power. Lord Acton is right. Power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. We have enough historical evidence to show that. So the question becomes, how do we, in our proclivities toward corruption, attempt to be accountable and then generate possibly some collective forms, because that's what democracy is essentially about. Ensuring that there's some accountability of arbitrary uses of power, political power, economic power, cultural power, personal power and so forth. That's what rule of law ought to be about. That's what regulation of markets ought to be about. That's what quality schools ought to be about. Socratic energy, prophetic witness, always over against the powers that be. In the world, but not of the world. Nonconformist in the ways of the world, because the way of the cross is always over against the ways of the world. And the ways of the world are always shot through with the idols of the day. The idols of power, position, status, truncated conceptions of goodness and greatness. That's why for Christians, Alexander is not the great. He's the dominator and the conqueror. That's different. Jesus is the great. Different lens through which you look at the world. And I would go as far as to say, and this is where I do have a deep blues sensibility. I come from a people who've been terrorized and traumatized and stigmatized for over 400 years. And the nation that understands itself to be the freest and most democratic in the world. And therefore, I have a very, very unique relation to the catastrophic that is hidden in the name of that which is innocent, pure, and pristine. You see. So U.S. slavery is not in the U.S. Constitution. What's going on? Little evasion taking place. 22% of the inhabitants of the 13 colonies enslaved, generating so much of the wealth, which is a precondition of the democracy. No reference to the institution. Compromise, conspiracy of silence, yes. But as Christians, does not the lens of the cross tell us to begin with the weak and the vulnerable? Does it not charge us, demand of us that we cut radically against the grain? Of course, there's a very rich tradition of abolitionists, white, black, and others in this nation. But they were very small, demonized, crushed, but ended up being truth tellers. Thank God for Harriet Beecher Stowe as well as Frederick Douglass. I would say the same thing about patriarchy in terms of the struggle of women across color. Same thing about empire. Notions that somehow an American baby has more status in the eyes of God than a baby in Pakistan or Yemen or Afghanistan or Tel Aviv or the West Bank. As Christians, we are charged to ascend from the group, the tribal, the clannish, to all made in the image of God. That makes you nonconformist, radically nonconformist. Same would be true in terms of our Jewish brothers and sisters. We don't know of a Christian civilization that hasn't had elements of Jewish hatred shot through it. 2,000 years. These days, oftentimes it targets Arabs and Muslims, but how do we keep track of the humanity of our Jewish brothers and sisters, Arab brothers and sisters, Muslim brothers and sisters? What form does it take? Well, that's where the rubber hits the road in terms of the serious political discussions. But the crucial thing is what the framework is that we bring. That's where Brother Robbie and I are very much on the same page. Now, he's a Catholic brother. He's a Thomist Christian. And I'm a Kierkegaardian Christian and a revolutionary Christian. People say, well, do you have anything left in common? We got a whole lot left in common. Because we got a framework of human fallenness. We got a framework of centrality of love. We got a framework of talking about justice. And most importantly, these days, and this is very important because we live in a culture of superficial spectacle where people are obsessed with dollars and smartness. And smartness has nothing to do with the Christian faith. The Christian faith is about wisdom. It's about courage. It's about sacrifice. Hitler was smart. White supremacists, male supremacists, homophobes, smart. Smartness can be used in devilish ways. Dollars can be used in positive ways, negative ways. It's about what kind of human being you are. That's where we come together, even as we have our political and ideological struggles, conflicts, and so forth. And we decide who's right and who's wrong. I know I'm wrong sometimes, but not too often. Not too often. Last point, though, and we're going to open it up now because I don't want to go on and on. We want to make sure you raise your voices as well. That for the younger generation, we're living in a moment of spiritual malnutrition and moral constipation. It's different when I was coming along. Very different. We had deep problems, but we had a willingness to aspire to integrity and honesty and dignity. These days, there's obsession with the 11th commandment, thou shalt not get caught. It really is. And I'm not just talking about elites, even though Wall Street is probably a good place to start in terms of forms of criminality and so forth, and still walking away free. But you see it in the middle classes. You see it among the poor. You see it in schools these days. Cheat in order to get a good grade rather than having integrity in the process of producing the product. The obsession with the deal. I want to make a good deal. What is the integrity of the process of the deal? I'm not concerned about that. I just want success. Don't tell me about what you're successful. Tell me what you're faithful to in your process of becoming successful. We're losing that in our cultural moment. And that moral constipation. You know, I used to have some conception of right, but it's stuck and it won't flow. All that greed and envy stands in the way, so it's just stuck in the way. We need a spiritual laxative to somehow allow it to get out. And this is a serious issue because there can be no democratic politics without some commitment to integrity, honesty, and decency. You can't have capitalist contracts if you don't have trust. If every site of an arrangement is just a manipulation. You can't have a marriage. You can't have a relationship if every moment is just a matter of manipulation and the use of the person for one's own personal pleasure. Where's the joy? Joyless quest for pleasure. That's a form of spiritual malnutrition. That's what so many young people deal with every day now. Every day. I hear it on the radio. The songs just flat. No drama, no story. And I'm not just talking about Frank Sinatra and Nat King Cole or Curtis Mayfield or the Jones Girls, but I'm talking about even the melodies and the harmonies just flattened out for bodily stimulation and instant gratification. That is a form of spiritual wasteland. And we didn't have to deal with that, though, brother. We didn't have to deal with that. And so when you talk about politics, you're talking about the culture as well as the nation state, as well as the economy. And it is true that I'm a self-styled democratic socialist, very much in some ways like Brother Bernie Sanders. But what we mean by that is that we just want to make sure that we can eliminate poverty, that workers are treated fairly so we don't have stagnating wages when the profits are breaking records, that there's some accountability of Wall Street. And if you live in a society in which 1% of the population own 42% of the wealth, then you shouldn't have 22% of your children living in poverty or 40% of your children of color living in poverty. Those are moral and spiritual issues, not just political ones. Because if you raise the question, what kind of human being choose to be, what kind of country do we really want to be? If we want to be oligarchic, plutocratic, too callous and indifferent to deal with the weak, then let's just say that and don't call ourselves democratic. Democratic is one of the highest descriptions of any social arrangement, because what you're saying is, lo and behold, you are fundamentally committed to a public life that has strong mechanisms of accountability of the weak, the middle, and the strong, the middle, and the weak. And that's part of the challenge, and that's very much what Sheldon Wolin, political theorist, was wrestling with. His last book was called Democracy Incorporated. And was one of the greatest indictments of our day. And he wrote that in his 80s. 80s, mind still sharp, committed to an unbelievable sense of possibility for the United States, but concerned with the dark truth-telling, because the condition of truth is always to allow suffering to speak. If suffering is not speaking, it's truncated truth-telling.
Well, I love the conservative part of that. But I'll tell you that the cultural criticism in the part 4, I think, of your 5-part presentation is very profound. And I would be curious to know from our young people whether you recognize your world, the culture you inhabit, in Professor West's exposition, which was then subjected, of course, to a powerful critique. I'll tell you a little experience that I had in my department. Fortunately, I was a spectator and not involved. And this is when a student who was scheduled to win a prize for her senior thesis was caught plagiarizing. Now, it wasn't plagiarizing the thesis, it was plagiarizing in another course. But because she had been convicted of plagiarism in the system, our department had decided not to award the thesis prize. Now, you can make the argument either way, that the conviction on plagiarism in an unrelated course should not have affected the prize. Or you could say, which I would say, that, well, no, look, our prizes are not there to reward people who are guilty of offenses as serious in an academic context as plagiarism. That's not the point. The point was, in our time, had parents shown up in the department to meet the faculty to deal with this problem, they would have been there to say how ashamed and embarrassed they were of their daughter's behavior.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
But the parents I witnessed were there to threaten a lawsuit against the university if the department did not give her the thesis prize. They did not think that she had earned it, that the plagiarism happened to be in a history course.
I see.
Now, I can only imagine, my younger brother's here, Edward's here, our dear beloved father.
And he's a wonderful man. I've met him.
He is a wonderful man,
Yes,
who scarcely ever raised his voice. Gentle man. We would have faced some serious wrath. And it wouldn't have been about getting caught.
That's true.
It would have been the lack of integrity
Absolutely.
embodied in the offense. And yet the world has changed. And I bring this up because our young people who are being formed in this culture of narcissism, what Christopher Lasch, the great Christopher Lasch, Professor West and I both admired so much, called the culture of narcissism, is not something these young people created.
That's right.
It's the previous generation, the so-called me generation, whose slogan was, if it feels good, do it, that has created a cultural milieu which was very aptly described by the great Robert Bellah in Habits of the Heart, his book Habits of the Heart, as expressive individualism. What matters is the imperial self. Talk about imperialism. In the expressive individualist culture, what matters is the imperial self. Me, myself, and I, that's what matters. My getting ahead, my satisfactions, my feeling good about me. So every relationship is a transaction. Whether it's your relationship with your professor. What Professor West, and he was congratulating a teacher here, our friend in the back, called a sacred relationship. It is a sacred relationship, teacher and student. That should not be a transaction.
That's right.
But even that is less scandalous than the relationship of husband and wife. Think of a marriage that's just a transaction. What I can get, what you can get. And we see in our celebrity culture the glorification of these marriages that last 15 minutes and that's it, because it's, am I getting out of it what I wanted out of it? or a relationship of parents and children, or of friends, where friendship itself has become transactional. I'm for this friendship for what I can get out of it, which is the precise opposite of what friendship really is, which was described so beautifully, I think it's book 8 of Aristotle's Ethics, in which he talks about a situation, a relationship in which I will the good of my friend for his sake, the active willing of the good of the other for the sake of the other, and he wills my good for my sake, the active willing of the good of the other for the sake of the other, in a dialectical relationship such that I value even myself more deeply in virtue of his love for me, because I know I am beloved by him, that I am his friend. He wills my good. My good is elevated in my mind by his appreciation because of my willing of his good. Are we capable of forming those kinds of friendships these days? And it's those kinds of friendships where people stick together through thick and thin. And when the going gets rough, you don't get thrown overboard. Professor West and I occasionally will say something, I know you're going to be shocked, controversial. Even for our own side. Am I right, my brother?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. And when that happens,
Absolutely, brother.
the phone's not ringing off the hook with friends who want to stand by you because you're radioactive, maybe in your little tribe or community. You know? Well, maybe we don't want, George there, he spoke out against this irrational discrimination against Muslims. Yeah, maybe we don't want to be too closely associated with him because in our conservative movement, maybe he's a little too hot now. Or when Professor West criticizes President Obama, the phone ringing off the hook with people who want to be photographed with you on the left.
I'm telling you.
No, it doesn't
My
happen.
mama and 2 or 3 others.
Yeah. And one of them, that right winger. Yeah.
And Brother Robbie, that's right. That's right.
But what happens when something like expressive individualism becomes a dominant force in a culture, becomes a force that shapes our personalities and understandings, is, of course, we don't know we're signing up for it. I dare say it affects us all, us old guys as well as young people.
Oh, yeah, we all struggle
This
with it.
me, this narcissism of the self, this imperial self, it affects all of us to some extent, and it's not as if we self-consciously adopt it. It just becomes what is natural. Just the way we look at ourselves and look at others and look at the world, and it shapes our experience. It seems to be self-justifying because it explains the experiences we're having. Intellectual historians sometimes divide the epochs into the age of this and the age of that and the age of the other thing. Some of you who've studied intellectual history will be familiar with the way that intellectual historians will sometimes call the medieval period the age of faith. And there's some truth in that. I mean, it's an oversimplification, but there's some truth in that. Or they'll call the Enlightenment the age of reason. So the medieval period's the age of faith, the Enlightenment's the age of reason. What do we live in? The age of feeling. So just as in the medieval period, faith was the touchstone of how should I live my life, what's true, what's false, what's good, what's beautiful. And in the Enlightenment, reason is the touchstone. The modern period, the so-called modern period, reason is the touchstone of what's good, what's right, what's beautiful, how should we order ourselves, how should we live our lives. Today, so often, it's feeling is the touchstone. And even in the ethical domain, how often do we hear ourselves saying to ourselves as well as others, when we're contemplating an ethical problem, I'm trying to sort out how I feel about that. As if feeling were the touchstone, that it was the thing that gave us access to truth, as opposed to faith or reason, or, more beautifully, I think, and more soundly, this reflects my Catholic Thomism, I suppose, faith and reason together as the touchstones of how we should lead our lives and order our lives together. John Paul II, who's now St. John Paul II, the great Pope, had a beautiful image, the opening of his encyclical Faith and Reason, Fides et Ratio. He said that faith and reason are like 2 wings on which the human spirit ascends to contemplation of the truth. And I think that is itself so true because faith itself requires rationality. Otherwise, it just devolves into emotion. And reason requires faith. Otherwise, reason turns on itself and we get scientism. Everything is reduced. And suddenly you find yourself affirming some crazy thing like, well, really, all that we are neurons firing in our brains. It's a reason untethered from faith, a reason that turns on itself.
I wonder to what degree, though, it has to do with a certain loss of hope. Because what is distinctive about reason and faith is that they're predicated on the indispensable virtue, which is courage. All the other virtues are empty if you have no courage. Courage is the facilitating virtue for the others, whatever they are, justice, temperance, whatever it is. And once we're moving toward a situation now we got ecological crisis or catastrophe impending, nuclear catastrophe escalating, economic catastrophe for so many poor and working people, spiritual catastrophe in terms of people not gaining access to quality family life, quality culture, so they can cultivate themselves as human beings rather than just being manipulated as objects for people to make money. Because we're talking about a highly commodified, marketized culture. And the end and aim is to sell everything. So we live in a time in which everything's for sale and also everybody's for sale. And so how do you find some space for hope, courage to think critically, Socratic, courage to love, Judaic, Christian, Islamic? That's the legacy of Jerusalem, all three of them. But once hope is eclipsed, courage pulls back, what do you have left but just titillation and stimulation? And that's what our young people have been dealing with in the last 30 or 40 years, you see. And that's part of the profound spiritual crisis, I think, that we're wrestling with. And in some ways, it's unprecedented. In some ways, it's unprecedented. And the dominant response is self-medication.
Yeah.
That's the dominant response. Because you no longer feel real, but it's self-medication. But the flip side of that, when it's not self-medication, it's on the terrain where domination rules. It's like in the music. You know, when I was coming along in the 1960s, the major song was Try a Little Tenderness, Otis Redding.
Yeah, beautiful.
Today it's Say My Name, Say My Name.
Yeah.
That's domination. That's conquest. Look at who I was able to get, as opposed to being measured by the quality of your tenderness and sweetness and gentleness toward the person you were responding to, not the object you were dominating for your pleasure. And this is a thoroughgoing orientation on television, film, across the board for the younger generation. And they make big money on it, huge amounts of profit on it. And it's reinforced over and over again, radio, film, video, performance, and so forth and so on.
A moment ago, you struck on a really important truth that I don't want to be overlooked or just to go by. And that is how this transformation, how a culture of narcissism, the cult of the imperial self, places in jeopardy democracy itself.
Oh, yeah.
If we have lessons from history of the fall of democracy, we're not the first democracy. We're not the first Republican government to use the word that was favored by our founders over democracy, because the connotations of democracy in those days had to do with kind of mob rule, the rule of unruly passions in a mob. Mm-hmm. But what we call democracy, sometimes it's called Republican government. Why has it fallen in history? Why has it fallen? It's because of the collapse of the cultural foundations of democracy. And when that collapses, when the virtue is lost in the people are always going to look to somebody who will promise quickly to solve their problems, give them bread and circuses. Miley Cyrus and Madonna. And somebody getting rich. Do you think Madonna's all about liberation? She's out there exposing herself because of liberation? You know, it's not liberation. She's making money. And making a lot of money for the suits in New York and out in Hollywood. But people don't realize that democracy is built on something. It's built on a culture. And when those cultural supports erode, there's always going to be the potential strongman, the demagogue, who's going to be there to promise, I can give you more and better, faster and more intense. I'll solve your problems. Whether it's a Mussolini or a Hitler or a Napoleon or whoever. We could go back into the Renaissance and in the medieval city-states. We could go back into the ancient worlds, into Athens. How do you think Julius Caesar came to power? And we ignore this point at our peril. If we want to preserve the Republican order, if we want to preserve our precious democracy, which I do believe reflects the principle of human equality much better than any alternative system, we've got to worry about the culture. Now, what you do is another issue, how we deal with this culture. I mean, we're not advocating censorship. You're not. I'm not. Right, censorship. But there are other ways that you deal with this culture. And one fundamental way is education. And it's got to be an education that causes people to look at themselves, a truly Socratic education, to look into your soul and to say, to what extent have I bought the expressive individualism? And do I want to buy that? What do I think matters in life? What will I regard as a success in life? And I love it in our teaching together when Professor West at the beginning of our seminars will often say, you're in this seminar to prepare to die. As he's encouraging the students to look at their lives from the perspective someday of their deaths. From that perspective, what looks like it's important? These Reeboks, having glamour, prestige, status, money. If you're making your decision, and look, this is not a criticism of hedge funds. You know, God bless the hedge funds. I hope they make a lot of money and give a lot to the Tocqueville Forum. But you shouldn't make your decision.
They need to be accountable.
They need to be accountable,
Oh,
true.
yeah, they got to be accountable.
But if you decide to make your fortune, make your life hedge fund, that's fine. That's a great career. Do it self-consciously, though. Do it from the perspective of the point of my death. Looking back now, is that something I would want to devote my life to? The answer very well might be yes. There may be lots of good things you want to do with the money you make from the hedge funds. You might be very interested in the way they work. Again, this is not a criticism of any particular profession. You can say the same things about being a lawyer, being a preacher.
Absolutely. Or
Or a professor, right? I mean, there are lots of there are lots of ways you can go wrong and right in any different professions, including professors and including preachers. But make your decisions from the perspective that really causes you to focus on what is important to life. And if we're doing our jobs, Ben and Jenna, correctly as teachers, we're forcing our students, drawing on the great works that we have available to us from Plato and from St. Augustine and the great thinkers, we're causing our students to look into themselves and raise those questions about what is ultimately important, what really matters. Is it power and prestige and money and so forth? Or is it something else?
Yes.
We've got just a couple of minutes left. And speaking of student questions.
Oh,
yeah, let's
We'll take
hear
as
it.
much time as you like. We're in no rush now. We're in no rush at all.
There are microphones.
I see a hand right over, there's one right over here. Yes, ma'am. Oh, you walked past her. There you go. Okay. Tell us who you are.
Hi.
If it doesn't work, just shout at us.
Hello?
Professor West and I believe we're used to being shouted at.
Hi, my name is Ariza Astari. I am part of the Tocqueville program. Thank you so much, Drs. George and West, for being here. My question is, in celebration of Tocqueville, he was one of the proponents of the separation of church and state.
Who was?
Sorry, Tocqueville.
Oh, Tocqueville.
Yes.
Yeah.
Tocqueville was one of the proponents of separation of church and state, but nevertheless, he says that religion is one of the first institutions of government in a democracy. And if you say that, Dr. George, if you say that Rawlsian purely political liberalism failed, and if you, Dr. West, say that we are morally constipated, then what ought we do in a democracy? Should we start legislating morality, or what do we do when we have different conceptions of what is morally
Excellent.
good or morally right? Is love enough? Thank you.
Wonderful question.
Excellent. Yeah, you go
Wonderful
first.
question. You want to jump in?
You go
or-
ahead.
Oh, absolutely. It's vintage Furman. High quality questions. One is that you can never present democracy to a people. Democracy has to come out of the heart, minds, and souls of a people. It has to be manifest in their manners and mores and sensibilities. That's part of the great insight of de Tocqueville, that he understood the fundamental role of civic institutions, quality families, churches, mosques, synagogues, other kinds of institutions, and education at its core. But education, not just cheap schooling. There's a qualitative difference there. You see, that high quality education has to do with that Socratic energy we were talking about. Schooling is just gaining access to a skill, no transformation of the soul, no reorientation of a self, no maturation of a people. Just flat with skills and money. Nothing wrong with skills, but it has to be embraced within a democratic context. The only thing we can do is to create awakenings and revivals. And what has kept the American democratic experiment going, even given its treatment of indigenous peoples and slaves and workers and women and gay brothers and lesbian sisters, there's been waves of moral and spiritual awakenings, calling people back to the best of what we can be. If there's no moral and spiritual awakening among a democratic people, it means we're running out of gas. And Gibbon's decline, the narrative of decline sets forth. If there's awakening, that means there's still a vitality and a vivacity in the people, a courage and a vision and imagination in the people that can call forth. Then you got renewal. Then you got transformation. And so in that sense, examples are the go-kart of judgment. We have to try to exemplify in the best that we can individually and collectively moral and spiritual awakenings around love. Yes, we Christians are, we ought to be locked on the love train now. I mean, Christians not on the love train, something wrong. Something deeply wrong. But we need more than love. We needed enactments of a love, a concern, a care, a consideration, a willingness to serve and sacrifice.
Tocqueville came to our country in the 1830s, this French aristocrat, to study the prisons.
Yes, he did.
But when he got here, he found a flourishing democracy in the most unlikely wilderness, this most unlikely provincial place, a flourishing democracy. He contrasts the situation with old Europe with which he was familiar as a reformer but an aristocrat. And he particularly was struck by the relationship of church and state, because the throne and altar situation of Europe was radically different from the relationship of the churches, plural, to the institutions of the state here. He found a separation of church and state, yes, unlike the alliance of church and state under the old regime in France, pre-revolutionary. But what he did not find is a separation of church and state like the French revolutionary conception, which separated religion and society, or religion and politics.
Yeah.
He found that the Americans had figured out a way to reconceive separation of church and state as separations of the institutions of the state from the church from the institutions of the state, more to protect the institutions of the church from the state than the state from the church, because the history of Europe is the instrumentalization of religion to the cause of the state. Ask any czar. Ask any communist premier under the Soviet regime. Stalin rehabilitated the Orthodox Church. He brought it back in the 1930s. Why? to instrumentalize it to serve the cause of the war. Frankly, ask Vladimir Putin today. Vladimir Putin's got a big alliance with the Moscow Patriarch. The Moscow Patriarch, maybe saw the photographs the other day of him, the Patriarch in all his regalia blessing the weapons that were going off to hold up Assad in Syria. But Tocqueville noticed that in the United States, no one held political office in virtue of an ecclesiastical appointment, and no one held ecclesiastical office in virtue of a political appointment. Even in a democratic monarchy, constitutional monarchy, a flourishing democracy like England, still, the prime minister, in effect, appoints the bishops of the Anglican Church. Now, maybe that works for them. But we're not buying that here. At the same time, we don't buy the French laïcité. Now, there's an extreme wing in the United States that would like to impose the laïcité system, the French separation of church and state. But it's a fringe, for all intents and purposes. It's probably disproportionately powerful because it's disproportionately believed among elites. But there's no popular base for that. I mean, Americans understand that their whole history and tradition, from the abolitionists to the movements to reform work conditions for women and for children, to Dr. Martin Luther King in the modern civil rights movement, we're all speaking from a Christian faith, unashamedly, unabashedly coming into politics with their biblical clothing on. Martin Luther King's marched, if you look at some of the old photos, arm in arm with Abraham Joshua Heschel, great Jewish rabbi, and with Richard John Newhouse, at that time very young Lutheran minister, later became a Catholic priest. There was religion all over the thing. And it works. And Tocqueville's great insight about America as he was watching this is that he saw that the institutions of civil society, what Burke called the little platoons, the non-governmental institutions beginning with the family, assisted by the church, the civic association, the fraternal organization, the mutual aid societies, these were the engines of health, education, and welfare in the United States. They were playing their function, and especially their function of transmitting the virtues needed for democratic citizenship to each new generation. That kind of civic virtue, in fact, that kind of personal virtue, is needed by every institution in society. There's no institution that can do without it. Not the economy, not business firms, not the legal system, not the political system. They all depend on there being a certain number of people, a certain pretty large percentage of people, who most of the time do the right thing for the right reason and not simply out of fear of politics, a fear of detection and prosecution. If all we had to rely on was fear of detection and prosecution for law breaking, the legal system would break down tomorrow. Believe me, it would. It'd be incapable of carrying that. Right. Now, how do we make it the case that there will be a large number of such people? To be workers and managers in firms, people who pay their bills, people who show up on time, not drunk, not on drugs, who don't embezzle even though they could get caught, who will do the right thing for the right reason, will serve on juries, be fair on juries, who will be responsible citizens. The state can't order that there be such people. A judge can't hand down an edict there will be such people. A business firm can't manufacture such people in a factory. If they're going to exist, they're going to be produced by the little platoons, the institutions of civil society, the family, the church or synagogue or mosque, the civic association, the Boy Scouts, the Campfire Girls, the mutual aid society, the fraternal organization. We have them in all our different communities, sometimes they're religiously based, sometimes racially based. They're based on ethnic alliances sometimes, and yet they fulfill that function. And Tocqueville, just conclude by saying, Tocqueville felt that it was necessary, very necessary, that these be preserved against predation. He recognized that they were essential to the functioning of democracy, but that they themselves could become a threat to the powers of government, and government would then try to squash them. Or if it didn't squash them, government would try to instrumentalize them, invade their autonomy, undermine their authority and their integrity. Look at China today. Why does China persecute not only Catholics, not only Tibetan Buddhists, not only house church evangelical Protestants, but even the Falun Gong? The Falun Gong isn't even a religion. It's basically an exercise phenomenon. with some spiritual elements to it. Why did the Chinese regime persecute them so viciously? It's they fear any independent civil society because that can become a base for action against the regime. It can become an alternative authority structure that might do to the Chinese communist regime what Solidarity in the Catholic Church did beginning in Poland, which then spread throughout the Soviet Empire and toppled the Soviet Union in the end. The Chinese learned all too well, the regime learned all too well what had happened when civil society was allowed to have some breathing room in that communist empire. And it doesn't want it to happen in China. So they get squashed or they get instrumentalized and taken out of the picture. Now, the final point is love enough? Well, no, obviously love is not enough. Even if we understand love correctly, not just as a feeling. Today people say love, they think, oh, it means feeling good. It's reduced to its affective component. But what love actually is the active willing of the good of the other for the sake of the other. Which is why Cornel says that justice is what love looks like in public. Right? It's a set of arrangements where the good of the people, the common good, the good of all, and the good of each is favored, supported, promoted. Now, of course, the trouble is twofold. One, at the moral level, we will have disagreements about what a true willing of the good of the other entails. What really is good for people and what's not good for people. And at a moral level, people are not going to come to 100% agreement. We're not going to get a consensus about that. Not today, not for a long time to come, as far as I can tell. Which means we need a functioning democratic system that we can all respect to generate at least tentative outcomes, never closed off to reform. They should never be insulated against future reform. And number two, and this is less challenging, but it's for real, people will reach different prudential judgments. Even where they agree on what constitutes the good of human beings, they will disagree about how to get there. Professor West and I profoundly agree about the importance of fighting poverty. We think it's disgraceful in a nation as wealthy and as blessed as this nation to have 22% in poverty.
With the kids, children.
Of children in poverty. And we look at the way poverty is distributed. We see it in urban, largely minority inner cities. We see it in white working class areas in old Rust Belt cities or in Appalachia. I came from West Virginia. If we look at Harlan County, Kentucky, Boone County, West Virginia, we see this. We're both, out of a Christian sensibility, no doubt, believers in the preferential option of the poor. The first thing you ask about a policy is, what is its effect on the poor? Then we'll proceed from there. But we would disagree when it came down to prudential judgments about what policies are likely to generate prosperity in those communities, helping them to overcome poverty. We probably have some disagreements. We haven't talked this through completely, but I suppose if we did, we might have some disagreements of how much requires reform at the level of fiscal or monetary policy, and how much requires reform at the cultural level, since family structure is correlated with poverty or affluence.
You think the Pope is closer to me?
I refuse to answer that question on my Fifth Amendment ground that it might improve.
I'm just messing with you. I'm just messing with you.
Oh, okay.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful, wonderful.
It's lovely to have power.
You two gentlemen have had an intellectual partnership now for some decades ago. What has your engagement with one another caused each of you to change your mind?
Wow, that's a wonderful question. Yeah, the question had to do with, given the critical conversations and magnificent dialogues that we've had to empower each other for 10 years, what have we really changed our minds about? How have those discussions led us to change our minds? Well, one, I do have very different readings of some of the great canonical texts in the history of philosophy as a result of teaching with my dear brother. And that's true from Plato to Gabriel Marcel to John Henry Newman to Martin King and others, that he sees various elements in text that I don't see. No doubt about that. And I think in terms of a political issue, we struggle over abortion, I think, probably more intensely than any issue. And I think I have been radically sensitized to the moral impulse behind brothers and sisters who see abortion as a moral abomination. And I've been sensitized by it in the sense that if I had the same empirical conclusions as my dear brother, then I would have a very different perspective on abortion. Abortion for me is a twofold issue. It has to do with keeping track of the humanity of the weak and at the same time ensuring that the mother who is giving birth has a choice and control over her body. And those two are not always consistent, but those are elements that I wrestle with. And he's been pushing me against the wall for 10 years on this issue. And it's a very, very difficult and painful one. And yet I still come down where I was before in terms of believing in the end that the right for free choice of a woman is one that does not lead toward the violation of the sanctity of a human being. And if it did, I would change my position.
But the arms that are severed are human arms. The blood that's shed is human blood. Where the face is cut through, it's a human face. I don't see how we can say it's not a human being.
Relative to which stage in the process that we're talking about?
Any stage. It doesn't begin as a
from day one,
fish and
from contraception.
From the point at which we have a new.
The point at which. You
point
snuck
at which
that
being
one in. You snuck that one in.
Fertilization.
Which point at which are we talking about?
The point at which. Here we go. The point at which we have a new organism that is continuous with the organism that is the 62-year-old Cornel West, so that we can say that the 62-year-old Cornel West is the same living member of the species Homo sapiens who was a brilliant 26-year-old graduate student at Princeton, who was an 18-year-old prodigy at Harvard, who was a mischievous 12-year-old adolescent reading Kierkegaard from a mobile book stand coming through Sacramento, to a 4-year-old child. And earlier in his life, he was a newborn infant. And earlier in his life, he was a 7-month fetus.
Irene's womb.
And that,
we're in my mama's womb now. At what point do you think we could draw that line for me to change my mind?
The point at which you have a new organism. Shall I tell you when that is scientifically?
Well, yes, but even
fertilization, because at fertilization, you have something that is genetically and functionally distinct. That is, it's got its own genome distinct from the maternal genome, and it is integrating its own organic functioning, taking in nutrition and expressing it as energy, and growing in the direction of adulthood, so that we can say that you or I develop from the embryonic stage into the fetal, infant, child, and adolescent stages, and ultimately into adulthood with our unity as an organism, our determinateness, and our identity intact. See, you can't say, and I can't say, I was once a sperm cell or an egg cell. Those were gametes, genetically and functionally parts of the parents. But you and I must say, because there's no avoiding it, that we were once embryos, the very embryo that at a later developmental stage we call a fetus, and a later development stage we call an infant, and a later development stage we call an adolescent. Now, shall I say where you worry me?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. I appreciate that.
It's the same sort of thing. It's the sensitizing to me of the relevance and meaningfulness of race. I think prior to my engagement with Professor West, I was inclined to say, we can solve all these problems if we're just colorblind. Why should we take note of color in any respect? You know, color was taking note of color, taking note of race was the problem. So let's just not do that anymore. But what reading Professor West's writings and our engagement and wrestling about issues like affirmative action and race-based policies in admission, employment, and so forth has sensitized me to is that it's race, although race in itself doesn't exist, I think you'd agree with
scientific fiction.
The scientific fiction.
Been institutionalized 400 years, yeah.
What it has produced is a culture.
Absolutely.
So there is a culture that includes the music of Duke Ellington,
Absolutely.
the thought of W.E.B. Du Bois,
Yes.
the witness of Harriet Tubman, the writings of a Baldwin,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And now that in itself isn't an argument for this or that particular policy, but it is an argument for saying you can't just read race out of the picture any more than you can read Judaism out of the picture. We can say we shouldn't discriminate against anybody on the basis of religion, but we can't imagine that being Jewish is meaningless. It's just a meaningless fact about a person, because a person who takes his Jewish identity seriously sees himself situated in a culture in a way that you see yourself, while a member of the universal human community, a citizen of the United States, a Christian, still in one important respect in your life, coming from African American culture.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Now, that's not something that prior to our engagement I was very sensitive to. My thought was, let's take race out of the picture. You know, that'll solve our problem. The way to get past race is to stop thinking of ourselves as black or white. Just get rid of that. But there's a deeper understanding of race that I think many people who are where I was on this issue need to at least consider. So it's a similar kind of sensitization